It was a quiet morning on July 2nd, 1932, on a small lake in southern Georgia called Montgomery Lake. A farmer named George Perry and his friend Jack Page were out on the water during the Great Depression. They weren't fishing for fame or records. They were fishing because food was hard to come by, and any fish they caught could help feed their families. The lake they were fishing wasn't a big famous reservoir. It was actually an oxbow lake connected to the Ocmulgee River. The water was murky, filled with cypress trees, weeds, and fallen logs, the kind of place where giant bass could hide. George Perry was throwing a lure called a creek chub fintail shiner, a wooden lure that was popular in the early 1900s. For a while, nothing happened. The morning was hot and humid, typical for Georgia in the summer. The two men drifted quietly in their small boat, casting towards stumps and thick cover. Then, suddenly, George's lure disappeared. At first, he thought he had snagged a log, but then the log started moving. His rod bent hard, and the fish began pulling the boat through the water. This wasn't a normal bass. This fish had serious power. Back in the 1930s, fishing gear wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. Rods were heavier, reels were simpler, and lines weren't nearly as strong. So when this fish started fighting, George knew he had to be careful. The bass surged toward the trees, trying to wrap the line around submerged branches. If it did that, the fish would almost certainly break off. George kept the pressure on. The fight went back and forth, the fish pulling hard and then diving deep into the dark water. Finally, after a tense struggle, the bass started to tire. Slowly, George worked it closer to the boat. When the fish finally came up near the surface, both men were stunned. This bass was massive. Jack grabbed it and pulled it into the boat, and when the fish landed on the floorboards, the two men just stared at it in disbelief. They knew it was huge, but they had no idea just how historic the catch would become. They brought the bass back to town and weighed it on a certified scale at a local post office. The number shocked everyone. The fish weighed 22 pounds and 4 ounces. That made it the largest largemouth bass ever recorded. At the time, there were no social media posts, no GoPros, and no cameras on the boat to capture the moment. In fact, George Perry didn't even realize the significance of what he had done. He had simply caught a giant bass. The story spread quickly through fishing communities, and eventually the catch was recognized by the International Game Fish Association as the official world record. And here's the crazy part. For decades, anglers across the country tried to beat that record. Millions of fishermen spent years chasing a bass heavier than Perry's 22-pound giant, but none succeeded. For 77 years, the record stood completely untouched. Then, in 2009, something incredible happened. A Japanese angler named Manabu Kurita caught a bass in Lake Biwa that weighed exactly the same as Perry's fish, 22 pounds, 4 ounces. Because it matched the weight instead of beating it, the record is now considered a tie between the two anglers. But many fishermen still consider George Perry's catch the most legendary bass ever caught. Think about it. In 1932, during one of the hardest economic times in American history, a farmer fishing for food accidentally caught a bass so massive that the record lasted nearly a century. Even today, anglers all over the world dream about catching a fish bigger than that, but nearly 100 years later, nobody has clearly beaten that weight. Some experts believe the record could still be broken, especially in places like California, Texas, or Japan, where bass grow extremely large. But catching one bigger than Perry's giant would require the perfect combination of genetics, food, water conditions, and pure luck. And that's what makes the story so legendary. Because on one hot summer day in 1932, a fisherman who wasn't even trying to break records ended up making fishing history forever. And somewhere out there might still be a bass swimming that could finally beat it.